Good evening all, and welcome to this very special episode. Today, I present a masterpiece by Tobias Wade, and am very fortunate to be joined by the sensational Nature's Temper. It's time to find out what secrets the unmarked building in Colorado holds. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. 4 years in the army, and not once did I hear an order from anyone ranked above a major. Now, I've been at the Dalton power station for 2 months, and I've already received 3 phone calls from James Mattis, the US Secretary of Defense. It seemed like a mundane enough job, right? My stint in the army helped pay my way through a bachelor's in power plant technology after I got out, and I was ready for a reliable income with good honest work. I spent a few years in equipment operations, then checking readouts, and then on up to personnel supervisor. There's nothing more exciting than a few power lines being blown over in a storm. That is, of course, until I was promoted to plant operator in Dalton.
You're going to notice a few anomalies with this plant,
the old manager Nathan told me. He was retiring, although by the size of his waistline and the dull glassy glaze over his eyes, I'd guess he retired about 10 years ago and just hadn't left.
But I don't want you to worry. I've worked here 20 years and nothing going on will interfere with your job.
Looks normal enough to me, I replied. Was this some kind of test? Single open cycle gas turbines, probably around 140 megawatts, right? If I was expecting praise for my perception, I didn't get it. That was the first time I've ever seen a grown man spit on an office floor.
Not about our output, boy. I mean our client. We're just supplying one building up in the hills. The rest of the city is handled by that hydroelectric station downtown.
This had to be a test. It didn't seem fair, since they'd already offered me the job. But there was no harm in playing along. No sir, that's impossible. This station should be able to supply around 140,000 homes.
Or one government building,
he grunted. Are we not producing at capacity?
We are. Hell, they'd take more if they could get it.
What are they doing up there? I don't understand. Nathan clapped me on the back, like I had just won an award.
And they like to keep it that way. So if you want to stick around like I have, then you'll do what I did and keep your nose out of their business. Besides that, everything should run pretty smooth for you here.
But Nathan was wrong. Right from the start, nothing ran smoothly. First of all, the other plant workers acted mighty strange towards me. Every one of them kept their eyes locked on the floor, all wearing the same glassy-eyed complacency that I had seen in Nathan. They followed orders readily enough, but they did so without the slightest initiative or individuality. I caught one guy, Robert, chewing his pencil for 10 minutes straight in the break room. I asked him what he was doing, and he mumbled that his schedule dictated a break every 2 hours. As soon as his 10 minutes were up, and to the damn second I think, he stood up and left the room without another word. And then there was Mattis calling every few weeks. Those were the most awkward, forced conversations I've ever had to sit through in my life.
Acting manager?
Were always the first words out of his mouth. John Doe speaking.
Clearance code?
I'd give it to him, and then he'd invariably ask me a string of the vaguest imaginable questions. It almost felt like he was being held hostage and had to speak in code to gather information. A few examples.
Would you consider everything to be more or less ordinary than usual? Have you had any unusual request for output to anywhere besides that building? In an emergency, how fast could you shut down the power to everything if you had to?
The financing is another thing that didn't make sense to me. Usually, a plant of this size will have a couple of dozen workers and needed its own financing department to keep track of everything. Here, we've just got Megan.
There's not much to do really. There's no money coming in. I just prepare a folder every month with all our expenses, mail it to some office down in DC, and they take care of it. They never denied anything before.
3 days ago topped it all off when I received the strangest question yet from Mattis. He asked if I'd noticed any of our employees trying to escape, like he was trying to clear his head and not his throat, and then corrected himself, asking if any of them were trying to quit or just not show up. The mystery was unbearable to me, but I was trained to follow orders, and despite everything, I could have maybe still accepted the situation if it wasn't for the black van which came by 2 days ago, the so-called shuttle service. Although it was only picking up Robert and another technician named Elijah. I watched the van take them up the dirt road winding into the hills. Yesterday morning, they were back at work, and I asked them what happened, but they both just laughed and said that they went out for a few drinks. Even the laugh felt wrong, like they weren't doing it because they thought it was funny, but rather made the sound in the hopes that I would find it funny and move on. The first thing I learnt about working in a power plant is that a pair of professional overalls and a condescending attitude can get you just about anywhere. All I had to do was strip one of the underground cables leading to the building, file a report on the output fluctuation, schedule my own appointment, and show up. There was a guard post out front, but I showed them my diagnostics appointment, and they let me inside under escort without complaint. I called it a building before, just because I'd only seen its location on a map. A mineshaft might describe the phenomenon more accurately, or perhaps a crater. The complex was clustered around an abyss, located at the bottom of an enormous valley, whose jagged slopes looked like the result of some cataclysmic primordial explosion, long since eroded and overgrown with spruce and pine. There was an unusual energy about the place, and I felt compelled to walk gently, as though stepping atop a living creature. That was probably on the account of the constant vibrations rippling through the ground, as though something deep below the earth was stirring. Most unsettling of all, perhaps, were the rows of black vans parked outside. 4 of them were being loaded with long bags about the size and shape of a human body. I caught the eye of the guard accompanying me, and I noticed its glassy shine. Any power cuts have serious repercussions here. Please resolve the issue as humanly possible. Humanly? Maybe my discomfort had me imagining things, but somehow it seemed like he had said it in the same way you or I might say, he's pretty smart for a dog. The guard led me to a control station about 100 feet away from the main complex. I couldn't get a good enough angle on the abyss to glimpse what would be down there, but up close, the vibrations resolved themselves into the distinct sound of drilling. I don't suppose I'm allowed to ask, I started. Won't do you any good, the guard answered promptly. I don't know any more than you, and that is already more than enough. Have you ever been inside? He shook his head, glancing around nervously. Then, in a hushed whisper, I've never seen anything, but sometimes I'll hear things, like something is down there that doesn't want to be. I raised my eyebrow, hoping he would continue. He opened his mouth, as if he were going to say more, and then he shook his head. None of my business. None of yours. How long is this going to take? I didn't push my luck by staying long. I traced the power restriction to the cable. I stripped and followed the black line away from the complex to the spot with the damage. I've been keeping an especially close eye on Robert and Elijah all day. I can't shake the feeling that they're not quite here. I caught Robert chewing on his pencil again, but he was doing it so absent-mindedly that by the end of his 10-minute break, he had eaten through the entire thing, graphite, eraser, and all. Elijah was even worse. He was microwaving a cup of noodles in the break room, anxiously pacing back and forth, like he was waiting for a bomb to go off. Then it beeped, and he actually collapsed to the floor in shock. I retrieved his glasses for him and helped him to his feet, noticing his eyes were so pale to be almost completely white. I'm positive they weren't like that before he went into the building. I searched through the computer's databases for any unusual mentions of the two, and found this log, written by Nathan, dated 2 months before I arrived.
Robert and Elijah's first pickup service today. Good for 5 rounds each before they're used up. Current staff. Round 0, 3. Round 1, 5. Round 2, 11. Round 3, 4. Round 4, 2. Round 5, 1. I'm the only one at round 5. Requesting replacement for myself in 2 months after my final round. Suggest replacement exempt from rounds to preserve his functionality. May God have mercy on our souls.
I scanned back further through his logs and saw a list of similar numbers. It seems like every week another pair of people are sent to the building, and their rounds are increased by 1. Elijah was currently at 4, whilst Robert was at 3. There was also a schedule of future pickups. I scanned ahead a few pages and didn't see my name anywhere. It was a relief at first, although the more I searched, the more unnerving it was to be the only one who wasn't on the list. Well, here goes nothing. I edited the next week to switch my name with Megan. She was around 1. It seemed like people were returning from whatever was going on there. And I know I'm not going to rest easy until I get a good look inside. I don't know what happens past round 5, but after trying to call Nathan's personal number, I'm pretty sure I don't want to know. I learnt from his wife that he put a bullet in his brain the day he left the plant. If all goes well, I hope to get to the bottom of this before I reach that point. If not, well, as Nathan said, may God have mercy on our souls. Tell me everything you remember, I ordered Elijah. I had waited until he entered the bathroom before following and locking the door behind us. The black van was going to be there in a few hours, and my excitement was quickly being replaced with dread. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I don't know what you're talking about, he replied in a monotonous tone, forcing myself to stare into his cloudy white eyes harder than I expected. On the nights you're picked up by the shuttle service, I said. I know you've gone 4 times now, and I know you weren't just drinking. I want you to tell me what happened. A euphoric smile replaced his pallid countenance. Then a frown, as though trying to remember the insubstantial details of a passing dream. But that's all that happened, he said. The shuttle picks us up, and they give us something to drink. Then I wake up in my home, and it's time to go to work again. And you feel just the same as you did before. The frown deepened. His eyes stretched so wide, I thought they would pop straight back out of his head. For a second, he seemed about to scream. Then his face reverted back to a blank slate. It happened in such a flash that I couldn't be sure the expression was there at all. But when he smiled, I could sense the tension still trembling in his cheeks. Better than ever. I find it invigorating, Elijah replied. He continued staring at me in the face whilst he opened his belt and dropped his pants around his ankles. I would have liked to ask him more, but I was shocked and revolted when he began to piss in the sink right beside me. I just turned around and exited the bathroom, without another word. Whatever was being done in the building had seriously damaged these people, and it looked like there was only one way for me to find the truth. When the van arrived, my name was called alongside Wallace Thornburg, fat guy in a bulky coat and with a hat pulled lower over his face. I don't remember seeing him before today. He nodded curtly at me, but kept his distance, shoving his way into the van moments before the door slid open. Francisco, with the shuttle service, the driver announced. The driver bounced out of his seat and held the door open for me. He was dressed in the same blue suit as the guard who had escorted me before, but this man's eyes were perfectly clear. I hesitated. Where are we going? You know, the Francisco replied. I found his tone overly familiar, and my doubts redoubled. What happens if I don't want to go? But you do. The driver grinned, and put on a pair of headphones. After that, he didn't speak another word for the remainder of the drive. I climbed in and sat on one of the two benches bolted to the metal floor on either side of the van. The fat man sat across from me, arms crossed, hat pulled lower over his face, looking like he was trying to disappear into himself. You been there before? I asked.
Wouldn't remember if I did. You're not supposed to be here, though. You weren't on the list.
How do you know? I asked.
Because I wrote the damn thing and I didn't want you to be. Of course, I'm not supposed to be here either, so I won't tell if you don't.
Nathan finally looked up. He grinned to see the shock on my face. Nathan did his best to explain the situation to me as we rumbled into the secluded hills. After each of his first 5 rounds of procedure, his memory had been wiped clean every time.
Waking up afterward felt like I was an alien in an unfamiliar world. Books, songs, people I had seen 1,000 times before, they all started giving me trouble, like some sort of puzzle. I even tried to quit once, but the longer I went without another round, the more lost I felt. It became like an addiction. I couldn't live without my fix. It would have been damn irresponsible for me to keep working when I can barely tie my own shoelaces, so I requested a replacement. That's why I kept you off the list, so we could have at least one level-headed soul to keep everything running.
Your wife said you put a bullet in your brain. Nathan chuckled and slid his hat further up his head. A bandage was wrapped around his temple, with a great bloody spot like a Japanese flag.
You blame me? I didn't think I could go on after my 5th round, and this seemed easier than having to manage without it. Next thing I know, I'm back awake and swearing like the devil. How's that for clearing your head? Worked like a charm, too. I felt more like my old self than I had in years. Now I know they'd never let me walk after a stunt like that, so I let people keep believing I was gone.
What are you? I knew he couldn't remember what they did, but the question slipped involuntarily from my mouth. Nathan glanced at the driver, still wearing his headphones. We were descending a sharp angle now, and must nearly be entering the valley. Nathan moved across the van to sit beside me, speaking in a hustled tone.
I figure there are 2 possibilities. That they made me into something that isn't human, or the good Lord brought me back. Either way, I figure it's my obligation to stop them from doing this to anybody else, so I switch with Wallace to throw a wrench in the cogs. Can I count on you to have my back?
He caught me staring at the bloody bandage, and slid the hat back over his face. I nodded stiffly, although I hated the idea of committing myself to a war when I didn't have the first idea of who was right. It didn't seem like people were being forced here. but if they were being manipulated with an addictive drug, then it was just as bad. The van pulled straight past the control station and stopped in the parking lot where I saw the bodies being loaded last time. The hum of the drilling was omnipresent here, and my whole body vibrated like my bones were looking for a way out. The guard handed us each a pair of headphones as we parked outside the building. "Wear these. It's only gonna get louder inside." Nathan shifted his coat awkwardly, clutching something in his pocket with one hand, whilst he put the headphones in the other. When he said wrench, did he mean he was smuggling some kind of weapon in here? The guards didn't seem to be paying attention, and simply walked into the towering structure with us at his heels. "Can you hear me okay?" Francisco's voice came through the headphones. I nodded absent-mindedly, walking forward in awe of the gargantuan internal structure. 3, maybe 4 stories tall on the outside, but it must have been built down into the abyss, because the balcony I was standing over dropped down further than I could see. In the distant depths, I thought I could make out a faint red glow, but my eyes were repelled from the void by an instinctual terror that I could not overcome. Endless rows of balconies marched below me into the penumbra of shadows, each containing a massive machine with cables extended downwards into the pit. Each machine had a tether of wires extending from the other end, which connected with a helmet being worn by a man sitting beside it. There must have been hundreds of them sitting so peacefully in response that they might have been asleep, and hundreds more men in blue suits attending to the machines. What the shit? I couldn't believe my eyes. I took a step back towards the entrance and almost tripped as I walked into something. I turned to see the guard offering me a glass of clear liquid. Nathan was already studying a second glass in his hand. "You're going to drink and sit at the machine," Francisco said. "When you wake up, none of this would have happened, but you're going to feel so alive that you may as well be dead now."
Not remembering it and not happening are completely different things. If we ain't gonna remember, you might as well tell us what's going on.
The guard sighed and rolled his eyes, languidly pulling a .44 Magnum handgun from his belt and playing with it in his hands. "I've told you every time, Nathan, and I must admit it's getting old, and every time I've told you, you still took the drink, so why not trust me and do it again?" Nathan growled and pulled his hat over to reveal the bandage. He reached inside his coat and produced a cell phone with a prominently flashing light.
Well, maybe I'm not as easy to convince anymore. So why don't you humor me?
Francisco calmly leveled the gun at Nathan's face, and Nathan lifted the cell to his ear. I took the opportunity to begin circling the guard, but then the Magnum pointed my way and I froze. 5 rounds might keep your friend alive, but how well do you think your friend will bounce back from a bullet to the face? The guard asked.
Acting manager?
Nathan spoke into the phone. His voice was different. I'd heard that voice over the phone before, but it had been from the office of the Secretary of Defense. "Put the phone down or I'll shoot. I swear to God, Nathan."
Clearance code? I want you to shut down the plant the moment I give the word. Are you ready?
"You can't. If we have a power out, every one of these people will die."
Bullshit. You're trying to save your own ass. Tell me what's really going on.
He's telling the truth. It happened last time there was a power restriction too.
I don't care!
Nathan gripped the phone so tight his fingers turned white.
Living like this. They're dead either way. I want an answer. Now.
Francisco swallowed hard. He nodded. "We're feeding it. If we stop, it's going to be angry."
What is?
I caught the guard glancing over his shoulder and turned to look at another man in a suit holding a rifle on the opposite balcony. "Watch out, Nathan!" I shouted. "Put the phone down, Nathan. You have to trust me." the guard said.
What is down there?
Nathan, put it down! The guards beside us nodded sharply. A crack split the tumultuous sound of the drill, and blood sprayed from Nathan's face. The rifle bullet had punctured straight through the back of his skull and emerged from his mouth. He looked over his shoulder in bewilderment at the man with the rifle, his whole face splitting open as he turned his head. 2 more cracks from the air from the handgun. Nathan was staggered to his knees. He hadn't let go of the phone. He spat a mouthful of blood onto the floor and rattled off a rapid sting of numbers. Another bullet slammed a hole straight through his forehead, but he didn't even hesitate. The guard lunged at Nathan, but I blocked him with my body, and we both went spinning to the ground.
Authorization granted. Shut it all down.
My face went numb as the butt of the handgun slammed into my forehead. I groped the air blindly and caught hold of the guard's suit jacket, but he ripped free and dove at Nathan. The former manager scrambled backwards, screaming into the phone the whole while.
Do you hear me? My name is James Mattis. I want the whole station offline right now!
The 4 bullets in Nathan didn't even slow him down as he scrambled away from Francisco. I locked eyes with Nathan right as he reached the edge of the balcony.
Did I save them? Did I do the right thing?
His voice broke, with desperation in my headphones. I pulled myself up from the floor, unable to tear my eyes away from his bloody face. You did what you thought was right, is all I could muster. Everyone held their breath, looking around at the lights and the humming machines. Connect me to the plant, tell them to keep the power, Francisco screamed into his headphones. And suddenly, the silence and the darkness were all there was. Red emergency lights flashed along the walkways for a moment, but row by row they snuffed out as the backup generators were overloaded. The lights on every balcony winked out. The hum of every machine spluttered to a stop. The vibrating pressure of the drills grinded to a halt. In the absence of all light, my eyes adjusted to see faint visible outlines from the red glare in the pit. Francisco roared with frustration and ripped his headphones off. He grabbed Nathan by the coat and rammed him against the railing. I leapt to Nathan's aid but was too slow. Nathan didn't make the least move to resist as he was tipped over the balcony, to plummet into the abyss. I ran to his aid, too late. The last glimpse of him I saw was a spiral of blood raining through the air in his wake. What's going to happen now? I shouted. The guard didn't answer with words, but his message was clear enough. He dropped his gun and started sprinting to the door. I should have just followed him, but I couldn't let all of this be for nothing. My feet plodded me, like a moth being drawn by a flame, until I could see directly over the balcony and into the abyss. Somewhere miles below the earth, where the drills once tore through the crust emanating a baleful glow. I watched transfixed as it shifted, seeming to slide from one side of the pit to the other. I turned and ran from the building. Guards, mechanical technicians, doctors, streams of people poured from the place to fill the black vans. But the men, tethered to the machines, were being left behind. They couldn't have all been dead. I saw one slide to the ground and begin to crawl, only to be trampled beneath a stampede of men in blue. I helped the man to his feet and dragged him out of the building with me. His lips kept moving, as though he were muttering something, but I couldn't hear it over the sounds of panicked screams and thundering footfalls. No one seemed to notice that I didn't have a blue suit in the mad escape. I crammed into one of the vans and huddled in the back whilst it roared up the valley walls. A noisy rush of speculation surrounded me, but I was incapable of joining the conversation. I don't know if anyone else stayed to look like I did, but I couldn't tell them what I saw. Somehow speaking of it would make it enough to be real. We were about halfway back up the valley when a deafening explosion knocked half of us from the benches to sprawl onto the floor. The van bucked and heaved like a wild animal, but managed to stay upright as it roared down the road. There wasn't a back window, so we all had to wait along the right side until the van made a turn up to the switchback road before we saw it. The foundations of the building had been detonated, and the entire structure slid off into the pit. The man I had saved from the machine, haggard fellow, with a long beard and eyes as white as starlight, kept muttering along the rest of the drive. He was hard to look at because of all the bloody sores on his head. The helmet he was wearing had wires which plugged directly into his brain, and when I had torn him free, I had left great patches of his scalp behind.
It can't die. It's already out. It's inside us all.
No one else spoke along the drive, so they must have all heard him too. We all just fixed our eyes on the window though, afraid to acknowledge what we all knew. I don't know how many people had looked into the pit before they ran, but I'm sure enough of us knew that the red glow wasn't really sliding like I thought it was at first. It was opening, and from somewhere in the depths of the earth, I had looked into a colossal eye staring back at me. After the convoy of vans exited the crumbling valley, we made a stop about a mile away from the plant. I heard mention that others were continuing to a nearby army base, but 6 cars, mine included, peeled away from the rest. The vans parked in a sharp circle, bumper to bumper, with their sliding doors all opening towards the middle. "Everyone out to the van and in a circle." It was Francisco. He was holding a rifle now, prodding people as they filed out. "Remove any hats, bandages and glasses. Anything which obscures your face. Nobody is leaving here until I get a chance to look into their eyes." He had been looking for signs of treatment. The bearded man I had saved was still in the back of our van with me. He looked so thin and weary. I wonder how long he'd been down there. I caught his eye, and the pure white orbs looked back with helpless pleading. We both flinched as a gunshot echoed throughout the caravan. 3 more shots, one right after another. "Filthy animal, just die already," Francisco said. 3 of us were left in the van, the driver, the haggard man, and me. I was about to step out when emaciated probing fingers clutched desperately at my shirt. "Please help me. I only did what they told me to do." The driver pushed past us to exit in front. If it hadn't been for Nathan's interference, I would have had my first treatment today. Then, I would have been the one to be executed, assuming I hadn't already been killed when the building was detonated. These people had been strong-armed and manipulated into obeying orders, and now they were being punished by the same people who made them do it. Besides that, I still wanted more answers. By the enormity of the thing's ancient presence, I had no doubt it was still alive down there. The people who had been feeding it must have known as much as anyone what we were up against. Mankind might be diverse in our values at times, but when there is a common enemy, as calamitous as that whispers our doom, we've got no choice but to stand together against its oppression. Anyone like Francisco who sought to divide us had to be labelled as an enemy too. I saw the keys poking out of the driver's back pocket as he climbed out the van. I snatched it, applying pressure to his back to distract him. I was trying to be subtle, but he lost his balance and fell straight out of the van onto his knees. "Hey, what the hell, man?" The driver was loud. Too damn loud. All eyes fell on me. That's the guy who helped Nathan, Francisco shouted. I launched the van door shut as he was raising the rifle. The haggard man shoved me to the floor, but before I could fight him off, I heard a metallic clang of bullets punching through the door where I stood a moment before. Let's move, the bearded man said, practically flinging me through the air and into the driver's seat. The van roared to life, smashing into the adjacent van to make enough space for us to escape. More bullets were raining through the walls, like a spiderweb of cracks filled the passenger side window. It must have been bulletproof glass, but it still wouldn't hold up for long under the assault. The pale-eyed man grunted as a bullet punched through his door and into his shoulder. The bullet seemed to barely break his skin before deflecting onto the dashboard. I present a masterpiece by Tobias Wade, and finally edging out enough room to drive. The car shot off down the road like a stone from a slingshot, the bullets rattling off the back as we went. Are you hurt? I asked the man. It'll take more than that to slow me down, so don't let them slow you down either. Not until we reach the plant. We can't stop. That's the first place they'll look, I said. They've all had their rounds, and that makes them targets now. We have to save as many as we can. How do you know about that? Who are you? Dylan. I used to be called. Doesn't seem right to call me that now though. Not much of Dylan left. We didn't have long to compare notes before I reached the plant. Two of the other vans were close on my heels the whole way. I'm not sure if we can fight them off and escape, but having a whole crew that can take bullets like vitamins seemed to be a pretty solid advantage to me. I didn't slow as we passed through the checkpoint, rammed straight through the automated gate. I didn't want to risk crossing any more open ground than I could, so I drove right through the glass door at the front of the building and parked inside. A bullet slipped by the ground near my feet the second I opened the door. I thought I had gained some ground on them. They couldn't already be here. Another bullet. This was coming from inside the building. They must have begun clearing the plant before I even got there. Dylan pulled me from the van and covered me with his body as we sprinted through the building. I saw him take 2 more bullets, both rattling to the ground after impact. Every room we passed was already strewn with bodies. Robert is dead. Elijah, Megan, all have been decapitated. Undergoing the treatment seemed to have given these people considerable resistance to injury and death. But there is no coming back from that. Dylan and I managed to get to the security surveillance room to see if anyone is still left, but it's only a matter of time before they find me. All of the video feeds showed men in suits fanning out through the power plant, most armed with long machetes, all stained with blood. There's nowhere left for me to go. Look, there's a few hanging on. Dylan pointed at one of the screens. 3 plant workers, I didn't even have a chance to learn their names yet, were huddled in terror inside one of the supply closets. Dylan showed no hesitation, already bounding out the door as though he knew the way by heart. I started to follow, but he was quick to close the door behind him. You stay hidden. I've been down there too long. There's nothing they can do to me that they haven't tried already. But you'll pop like a ripe melon hit by a hammer. That was vivid enough for me to stay put. I watched him on the security feed as he dashed through the hallways with inhuman speed. If you'd asked me this before this started, I would have told you that humans are the good guys and that the monsters can go to hell. Scanning the familiar workrooms and seeing the bloodbath, watching the men with machetes butchering corpses, which still struggled to move. Then, followed the trails of bloody footprints all over the building. Well, maybe there aren't any good guys here. Shit, I don't know. Maybe I'd even be better off joining Nathan and the thing in the pit. Even thinking about that felt wrong though. The visceral terror I experienced whilst looking down into that great red eye will be enough to haunt me for the rest of my days. If I could only just get out of here though, I could let the whole mess of them tear each other apart and stay out of it. I was just about to make a run when the door was kicked open. Francisco stood alone with a bloody machete in each hand. His eyes were wild, looking even less human than Dylan's vacuous stare. Red handprints crawled their way around his leg, where his victims doubtlessly clutched at him before the final killing blow. "I thought I'd find you here," he said, his dress shoes making a wet squelch as they plodded across the room towards me. I backed up against the wall, but I was cornered. "I'm still human. Nothing's been done to me. You don't have to do this. I didn't have to kill the others either. I wanted to." The moment they were plugged into those machines, they were more beasts than man. "We're both men, though. We're both on the same side," I said. I was throwing words that came to my mind, but nothing seemed to slow his relentless advance. I picked up the office chair and brandished it at him, but he only laughed. "Think again, smartass." I hurled the chair into the surveillance screens and watched it smash them to pieces. Francisco's smirk twisted into a snarl. "I know where the others are. You won't find them without my help. Not before they escape." "Fine, I'll let you live. Just tell me who's left," he growled. "Not good enough. I want to know what's been going on. I want to know everything you know." "There's not enough time." "Then stop wasting it." He glanced at the broken monitors, then again at the long track of hallway where he came from. Francisco expelled an irritated sigh, propped the chair up and had a seat. That's when I finally got the whole story. The valley had been the result of a primal asteroid smashing into the Earth. A scientific expedition to unearth fragments resulted in the discovery of unusual movements within the lithosphere of the Earth's crust. 2 tectonic plates had switched directions and were moving against the surrounding mantle, which resulted in much of the mountainous terrain in the area. The government deployed a mining expedition, looking for clues as to the build-up of pressure, and that's when they discovered it. The devil, the beast, the monster, whatever impoverished word man had in the face of such a cataclysmic being dwelling beneath the earth. The scientists speculated that it was much too large to have been carried on the asteroid, but perhaps a seed or a hatchling had survived the journey and grown through the eons into the monstrous form that was uncovered. The mining further served to disturb the being, and its increasing activity threatened its pending escape. Nothing short of a nuclear weapon was likely to harm it, and this would be impossible to covertly detonate without radiating the surrounding groundwater and devastating the nearby population centers. The only method which seemed to slow the creature down was crudely referred to as sacrifices. The thing displayed considerable less activity after it consumed the initial miners, and subsequent experiments devised a way to feed it, via the network of machines and mental energy which I had witnessed. They had powered the machines for the last 20 years, but the sudden cease of energy seemed to have woken the creature, prompting the shaft's demolition. If there was more of the story, I didn't get a chance to hear. Francisco was getting impatient, and I didn't know how much time I could buy. Luckily, I didn't have to. Dylan returned during the recounting, and whilst Francisco's attention was still distracted, he pounced. I say pounced, because only an animal could have flown through the air like that pale-eyed demon. Before Francisco could turn his head, Dylan had wrapped his thin arms around the guard's neck and snapped it like a twig. I would have been grateful if it had not been for what happened next. Dylan bit deeply into Francisco's neck, whilst his limp form was still convulsing in Dylan's arms. Even with human teeth, Dylan was able to rip out great chunks of flesh from the man. The teeth sank through the mesh of veins and arteries, crushing through the spine and straight out the other side. It almost took a full minute for him to gnaw his way through. I don't think he was even eating it, but simply reveling in the satisfaction of his power. I didn't say a word. I didn't look away. I just let it happen. Every time I thought I knew what I was doing, the scale of events far surpassed my expectations, and I was just left a helpless onlooker. After Dylan finished, he gave me a sloppy grin before leading me safely through the building, and it was clear which was cleanly severed with a machete, and which had been gnawed loose. Dylan had saved the 3 other people though, and I owed him my life as well. That's how I learnt the last part of the story that Francisco had left out. The people who were hooked to the machines, they weren't just feeding the thing. It wasn't just the human mind passing down the cables. It was also the mind of the beast passing up to them. With each round of treatment, the subjects became a little less human and a little more monstrous, until they became something like Nathan or Dylan, and couldn't live and wouldn't die. Dylan had been one of the original scientists who sacrificed himself to the creature over 20 years ago, and had voluntarily shackled himself to the machine at the time. He's right though, I shouldn't call him Dylan anymore. Dylan died a long time ago. As soon as I was out to freedom, I parted ways with the subjects. I got into my car, and I drove as far and as fast as I could. As far as I know, the creature is still down there, buried beneath countless tons of rock in the hills of Colorado. I don't know whether its body is still going to try and move out or not, but I don't think it even matters. The beast thinks with Dylan's thoughts and moves with his body, like an avatar of some forgotten god. He now freely walks the earth. His zealous protection over the other subjects makes me believe that the beast's imperative is to protect his own, so I can only assume that Dylan is now working to free the creature or spread its influence by bringing more sacrifices to its underground lair. I don't know if he can be killed, and I don't know if he can be stopped. He still must feel some sense of human compassion, or he'd have never let me leave as a thanks for aiding him. So one enduring hope still remains to me, that once the beast has risen to the height of its size and power, it still finds enough room for mankind. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. What a story. It was quite challenging to put it all together, so I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. I'd like to extend a big thank you to Nature's Temper for lending his amazing voice, as well as Tobias Wade, of course, for his outstanding work. If you'd like to hear more from Nature's Temper, you'll find a link in the end of the video or in the description. And to read more from Tobias, you'll find a link in the description as well. It would mean the world to me if you would show the video some love by leaving a like and dropping a comment, as it goes a long way. And why not consider sharing it with a friend or someone who you might think will enjoy it? A story this good deserves to be shared. Wouldn't you agree? Just a reminder that you can get into the holiday spirit with my new merchandise, which can of course be found in the description, along with the links to my social media, as well as my Patreon, if you're feeling extra generous. And if you'd like me to read your story on my channel, feel free to send it to my email or share it with my Reddit, which can of course be found in the description. Please make sure to include as much description and punctuation as possible to maximize the chance of your story being read. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.
There's another one, Todd, up in the corner.
Michelle said. She pointed towards the day's 11th intruder, cowering under a fold in the tent's ceiling. No pity, no mercy. I brought the wrath of God down upon its head.
That's the last of them?
Yup, that was the last mosquito on the planet, hun. You're welcome.
Well, just in case, throw up that insect repellent thing outside and let's get some fucking sleep. I'm beat.
I unzipped the flap and set up the lamp outside and turned it on. It glowed a dim yellow and it pushed back the darkness just enough to illuminate two other would-be invaders that dipped their wings at the light and flew away. I zipped up the tent flap and said, "Reminds me of Passover."
Yeah, except I might actually choose death of the firstborn over this shit.
Well, we haven't had a kid yet.
Exactly. That means we get off scot-free.
I knew I married you for a reason. Anyway, I'm exhausted. I kissed her and crawled into the bag. Tomorrow we hit the cliff.
Tomorrow we hit the cliff.
And with that, we fell asleep.
Todd, wake up, kiddo.
Ugh.
It's morning. Ready to rock and roll?
What time is it?
9 a.m.
Oh, we're late.
We've still got the whole day ahead of us, but I do want to get out there by 10.
Yeah. I waved her off and sat up and rubbed my eyes. I'd kill for some eggs and bacon right now.
But how about a granola bar?
Or a granola bar. Haven't had my fill on those yet. She tossed me one and ate the other herself, and then we unzipped the tent and stepped outside. Then she stopped.
Whoa.
She leaned over and picked up the repellent lamp and switched it off.
How old did you say this thing was?
Brand new. I got it last week.
Did you get it at a scratch and dent auction?
She showed me a large chip along the middle of the glass that definitely hadn't been there before, and which was covered in the unmistakable brown smears of mosquito blood. I took it from her and turned it over in my hands. The hell? I swear to God it was in perfect condition last night. Maybe it was just dark and I didn't notice it.
Todd.
I looked up and then down and around at where she was pointing. There were at least 100 dead mosquitoes lying in the dirt. Maybe several hundred. Gross. Let's get a move on before I puke. So I tossed the lamp into the tent. We shouldered up our gear and then we hit the trail. The dirt path wound up out of the campsite where a handful of other hikers had set up shop, and then it curled around the crest of a wooden hill and carried on through the forest and up a mountain slope. We spent the walk waving off mosquitoes. Did you bring any bug spray? I slapped my neck for the 100th time and couldn't help but notice how painful the bites of these particular mosquitoes were. I'm getting eaten alive out here. She sprayed herself down a little and then tossed me the bottle, and I almost showered in it. I'm not sure it did much good though. The mosquitoes were out in force, and the further up the mountainside we went, the worse it got.
Son of a bitch! Little bastards flew down my shirt!
Michelle was slapping at her stomach and waving her t-shirt to force them out from the bottom. I saw one or two fly off.
Is this even worth it?
I think so. It's muggy down here, but it should clear up when we get to the scramble. Mosquitoes probably aren't going to be swarming anywhere with a good amount of wind.
I think we'd need a hurricane at this point.
Right? I feel like that guy from Gulliver's Travels, getting attacked by little people who think he's a giant. What's his name again?
Gulliver?
That's the one. But hey, look. She followed my gaze and saw, not a few 100 yards up, the boulders at the top of the mountain. There was even a spot of neon green and one of orange that stood out among the gray, clearly the jackets of other climbers. Almost there, and there are people up there too. It can't be all that bad. The sight of company and open space afforded us a burst of renewed energy, and we walked briskly up to the tree line and out onto the gravel that marked the beginning of the rock's scramble. And that view, no longer obstructed by the forest, we could see how the mountains sloped out majestically and poured out into the countryside. From up here, we could see roads too, and towns, and a patch of woods and farmland stretching out into the valleyed horizon, dotted at the far end with blue haze silhouettes of other mountains and other hills and other places to explore. We stood and took it all in for a while, and for a moment, we'd forgotten all about the mosquitoes. But then one darted my neck, and I slapped it instinctively and came back to reality. Come on, hun. Still too close to the woods. The rock scramble was a welcome break from all of the hiking. Each pile of arrow-marked rocks presented an obstacle that it took skillful teamwork to overcome, and by quarter till we reached the halfway point from the start of the scramble up to the summit. I couldn't help but notice, though, that the mosquitoes hadn't even slightly let up. I used my arms as much to wave them off as I did to climb, and if I got attacked while engaging both hands for balance or support, I'd have to spit at the damn things to ward them off. Michelle was as agitated as I was.
How the hell they get up this far? God damn it.
I don't know, hon. They're starting to piss me off too. I swatted another one on my cheek and winced at the pain.
Maybe it's not windy enough.
Maybe. Either that or they're not as put off as the wind as I thought.
I hope these things aren't loaded with malaria.
She said it half jokingly, but then she paused at her own thought and turned in my direction.
They don't carry malaria, do they, Todd?
In the States? No. At least, fuck, I don't think so. I looked down at a freshly smacked mosquito by my boot. It twitched once and then stayed still. Michelle groaned audibly.
Isn't it really deadly?
Yeah, partly because it's more prevalent in the third world, where they don't have proper medical infrastructure to deal with it. But all the same, yeah, you sure as hell don't want malaria.
Well, you're the one who's been here before. Think we should turn back?
No. The path loops around the summit, and it's not as heavy wooded on the other side. We've got a better chance of avoiding these things if we just keep going. So on and on we went, up and over the boulders, and getting closer and closer to the peak of the mountain. Mosquitoes harassed our advance the entire way. I tried to be positive for both our sakes, but I had to admit, this wasn't fun anymore. Not even a little bit. Michelle stopped abruptly, about 15 minutes later. What's wrong? You okay?
Those two spots haven't moved at all since we started up.
I looked up. She was right. The green and orange spots had stayed perfectly still for the full hour or so since we'd started the scramble. I got a little chill in spite of the heat. Maybe they're just taking a nap.
Maybe.
I could tell by the quiver in her voice, though, that she didn't believe that for a second. Neither did I. Still though, on we went, climbing and scrambling, and doing our best to stay focused. We smacked and swatted away at mosquitoes as needed, but their presence was beginning to do more than annoy me. I was getting a bit worried. What the hell are these things? Not for a full second after that thought manifested, we heard a rough commotion a few feet up. We stopped dead in our tracks and shot each other a pair of glances. And then we nearly dove out of the way as the man and his daughter came flying down the mountain and nearly bowled over us in the process. Corey! Hey, what the hell? Corey! The man shouted over his shoulder as he flew on past. We watched the two of them disappear on the other side of the boulders, and then we looked at each other again. Corey.
What the hell is that all about?
I don't know. Let's just keep moving, okay? I'm getting really sick of this hike. We crested the next few boulders and passed under a stone tunnel, and then we emerged at the bottom of the final rock slab that peaked at the mountaintop. Even from down here, we could see the figures of two people, one in a neon green windbreaker and the other in orange, laying on their backs a few 100 yards away. We moved forward cautiously. Oh, please be sleeping, please be sleeping, please be sleeping. But they weren't, of course. The first proof we had that something was wrong was a faint buzzing coming from their direction. And when we inched even closer, we discovered the sound was emanating from a swirling cloud of maggots above that were indeed a pair of corpses. I retched. Michelle screamed and covered her eyes, and then she turned to me, still bent over with my hands on my knees, and said,
Todd, what did that guy say earlier? The one barreling down the hillside?
I don't know. Hooray? Or Corray or something.
Corey? You mean Corey?
I blinked. Sounded right. Yeah, I think so.
Todd, Corre is Spanish for run.
Another chill. I stood up and I blinked, and then I took another glance over at the corpses. Then it hit me. Those aren't maggots. Michelle, we have to go, now.
What?
We have to go, come on. As if on cue, the cloud of mosquitoes lifted up from the corpses and began drifting aggressively in our direction. Michelle shrieked again, and we took off down the mountainside the way we'd come. We leapt over small boulders and slid down bigger ones, risking twisted ankles and broken bones, and then we hit the pay dirt of flat ground and launched ourselves under the tunnel. Behind us, we could hear the howl of incoming mosquitoes that was only amplified by the acoustics of the rock's ceiling. Come on! I reached down and yanked Michelle up out of the tunnel, and we hoofed it back towards the slab of the start of the scramble. I stole a glance over my shoulder as we fled and confirmed the intuition that things were gaining ground rapidly. I pumped my arms and legs in sequence as fast as I could, and Michelle did the same, and soon we burst back into the tree line and started half running, half leaping down the dirt and gravel pathway. We flew over rocks and roots, dove under branches, tore through smaller formations of mosquitoes laying in wait for us, and thrashed through the thicket and the shrubs that covered the pathway leading back down the creek. The sound of rushing water gave me an idea that I threw into action without a second thought. Into the water, come on! But we never made it in. Instead, we stumbled to a knee-rattling halt at the edge of the riverbed. Michelle retched this time, while I just stood there in disbelief. The man and his daughter who'd flown past us earlier were laying face up in the water, freshly killed, and yet already blue and gray and depleted. Their skin stretched tight across the bones, their blood having been drained through a network of uncountable puncture wounds. I dry heaved again, but this time it was Michelle who pulled me to my feet.
Todd!
I whirled around to see the horde of mosquitoes from the cliffs bearing down on us, and when I turned back toward the river, I saw another group of several hundred, likely the ones who killed the father and daughter and then flown off in a search of another meal, flying back upstream, a 2-for-1 deal having suddenly appeared on their plate. Michelle grabbed me by the left wrist, and we splashed through the creek and gained the far bank, and continued running, breathing sharply and rapidly, but ignoring that too. All that mattered was getting back to the tent, grabbing the car keys, and getting the hell off this godforsaken mountain. At last, we could see the campsite clearing up ahead of us, and the two of us, long since having shed the weight of our bags on the trail behind us, dove down the last bit of path and into the first row of tents. It was empty here, I noticed. Empty and quiet, and I could plainly see several other tents had been opened and ransacked. At no point since we'd arrived had there been fewer than 6 or 8 people milling around, even the busiest climbing hours of early afternoon, but now there were none, and I had no intention of finding out why. I held open the tent flap. Come on, help me out.
What the hell are you doing? Those things are right behind us.
You want to run all the way home? I left the keys in here so we wouldn't drop them up there on the cliff. Help me find...
Todd!
I didn't have to turn around to know we'd run out of time. The unmistakable buzzing sound of an incoming fleet of mosquitoes made that perfectly clear. Michelle flew into the tent, and I dove in after her and zipped it up fast enough that only a few handfuls of those bastards made it inside, as opposed to several thousand. I found the keys, and then the two of us whipped and thrashed throughout the tent, smacking our exposed skin whenever a mosquito landed on it, and stomping any of them dumb enough to hit the ground. We used whatever we could, books, pans, empty granola bar boxes, to kill the ones on the walls in the tent. And outside, we could hear the buzzing of the other mosquitoes flying up against the canvas. Damn it! I smacked my neck and splattered a large bug that apparently stabbed me with a knife, if the pain was any indication. What the hell kind of mosquito hurts this bad? Michelle didn't answer. She just brought her boot down on 3 mosquitoes at a time and spat on them. Then she turned to me.
What now?
I shook my head. Those things are everywhere. I don't know how the hell we're gonna get out of here.
What about the lamp?
I looked at it. It was in piss poor condition at this point, but I knelt down and turned it on. Worth a shot. I'm not dying in here. I looked up just in time to catch a wood green windbreaker she tossed in my direction. It's 90 degrees out there. We'll sweat to death in these things.
Not for warmth.
She zipped hers up to the chin and threw up her hood.
For cover. The less skin we expose, the better.
Then she showed me her forearm. It was so red and infected from multiple bites, it looked diseased. I shuddered a bit and then felt my neck. I could tell, even in the absence of a mirror, that I looked just as bad. These mosquitoes aren't normal, are they? She shook her head, although the question was theoretical, and then she rolled up her sleeve to the wrist and pulled the hood tight until I could see only her nose and the glint of her eyes. You ready?
Nope.
Good, let's get going. I covered up as much as she did, and then brought up the lamp. Then she grabbed the zipper of the tent and looked at me. I nodded, and she dragged it down. The mosquitoes flew in, but immediately recoiled at the lamp and hung back a bit, and Michelle and I tore off down the 3-mile path towards the parking lot, keeping our heads down as low as we could without losing sight of the road. As we ran through the campsite, I nearly twisted my ankle tripping over pots and pans, shoes, and clothes that had been strewn about in panicked hassle as the crowd fled. I saw a bloodless blue hand too, that of an elderly man from the looks of it, although it was hard to tell. That was flopped limply out of one of the tents nearest to ours. I swallowed vomit and kept on moving, and behind us we could hear the roar of mosquitoes as they pursued us. I looked down. Shit. The mosquitoes were suicidally ramming themselves into the lamp glass to shut off the light and allow the horde to descend. I waved it around a bit as we ran, but they were insistent and they were determined. And if we didn't make it back to the SUV soon, they'd destroy the lamp, and then Michelle and I would end up like everyone else did. So on and on we ran, huffing and puffing and wheezing. Her blissfully unaware, and me hoping and praying that the integrity of the glass would withstand the onslaught until we could make it back to the car. Under branches, over rocks and roots and fallen logs, through mud and muck, and underbrush and everything you can imagine, and all the while the mosquitoes bore down on us. We whipped and smacked if they got too close, and at one point, I grabbed a fist-sized rock while flying past it and chucked it into the cloud of insects behind us. But they didn't even blink or even seem to notice. They were driven to fulfill a singular purpose and would either accomplish it or die trying.
Todd, look!
I did. Off to the side of the road was the smoldering wreckage of a sedan that had been wrapped around a tree. 3 of its doors had been hurled open, and the interior of it was buzzing with mosquitoes. On the ground, we could see fresh corpses too, turned gray and blue with bloodlessness. Then another figure, a woman in her mid-30s, spilled out of the driver's seat and crawled around on all 4 broken limbs, hacking and wheezing and grabbing at her throat. Even from the increasing distance between us, I could see and hear a withering mass of insects in her mouth. Oh God, Michelle. She's choking on those damn things. We can't just leave her here.
Are you out of your mind? We go back there to throw her on our backs and we're all dead.
I noticed the slur in her words and was about to ask, but then I heard a muffled scream and shot another glance over my shoulder, just in time to see a detachment of mosquitoes break off from the cloud pursuing us and descend on the poor woman. I heard another shriek, I heard thrashing, and then I heard nothing but the constant hum of 100,000 buzzing wings. She was gone, and all the while the cloud inched closer and closer. The low hum turned into a roaring, overwhelming, all-consuming buzz. I doubled my efforts. I felt like my lungs were about to burst, like every muscle in my body was about to deflate and slide off the bone. My breath was short, it was rapid, and it was sharp. It hurt in my chest and in my throat, and we were still a good mile away from the parking lot, which for all we knew may have already been ransacked by 500,000 mosquitoes, or may have been blocked off at the interstate ramp by panicked, fleeing hikers. But we'd crossed that bridge when, or if we ever reached the damn thing. I looked over at Michelle. She was in even worse shape than me, sweating, gray, gasping for air in short, raspy breaths. Her gait was lumbering and awkward, and she appeared to struggle to mount minor obstacles in her way, like roots and stones. It instantly became apparent that whatever venom these mosquitoes carried was stacking on top of the exhaustion and beginning to work its magic on her at an accelerated rate. She was slowing down, struggling to move, and covered in red, pestering welts. Her head began to dip and sway, and then her knees buckled and she stumbled forward. I reached out and grabbed her arm and yanked her back up, and then I used my body to keep hers upright as we staggered our way to safety. Come on, babe. Just a bit more, okay? All my energy and all my strength of arms was bent on just getting us to the damn SUV. 1/2 mile. I could feel the keys jingling in my pocket. A quarter. I could almost smell the interior of the cabin. A 1/5. I began throwing together a plan to get both of us secured in the front seats and have the damn thing locked down in the Olympic seconds we'd have between our reaching the door handles and the mosquitoes doing the same. A 10th. Come on, you son of a bitch. Move. My legs were numb, but all of a sudden, there it was. The parking lot. I could see the sunlight glint off the roof of the sedan. I got a burst of renewed energy and flew down the last patch of dirt and gravel, carrying an increasingly immobile Michelle behind me. I grabbed the key and disengaged the locks. And then I threw Michelle into the passenger seat, and before running around the hood and almost leaping headfirst into the driver's side, getting bit and pelted the whole way, and slamming the door just as a wall of mosquitoes rammed up against all of the windows with an enormous collective splat. The insects kept up their assault, hitting the windows in waves, and it sounded like a rainstorm. I took a mount after killing the handful of mosquitoes that slipped in with us to gasp for breath and regain some composure. Then I shot a glance at Michelle and found her almost catatonic, struggling to breathe and move. Her eyes were wide and her hand was struggling to make a fist. "Michelle!" I leaned over and felt her pulse. Rapid, hard. She was alive, but if the foam at the corners of her mouth was any indication, she might not be for long. So I threw the key in the ignition and turned it and slammed my boot onto the gas pedal. Come on, move, damn it. I did my best to ignore the slurs in my own speech and focused on getting us out. The tires whirred and screeched, and then we were off, carrying a horde of mosquitoes behind us. They did their best to keep up, I'll give them that, but by the time we rounded the corner that led to the main road, the insect cloud and the constant buzzing were beginning to drift away into the rearview mirror. Fuck! I slammed on my brakes so hard the SUV almost flipped over onto its roof. It shuddered and shook, and then rattled to a halt. And Michelle and I lurched forward with all of the momentum and almost smacked our heads up against the dashboard and the upper half of the wheel. I made sure Michelle was still secure, and then I took a moment to stare out at the scene ahead of me. It was a massacre. There were motorcycles, cars, minivans, and bicycles laying all over the road and off to the sides. Blinking hazards glowed through the fog in sequence. Doors were thrown open, luggage and gear tossed all over the ground. There were bodies too, dozens of them. In fact, men, women, and children. All spilled out of their seats and drained of blood and fluids and set in torturous, final positions. Slowly and cautiously, I released my foot from the brake and the SUV rolled forward at a snail's pace. It carried me straight down the road, between the wreckage, and on the sides I could see the corpses in more detail. Some were still twitching, others looked nearly mummified by drainage. They all had one thing in common, an enormous mid-torso wound that pierced the spine, so as to paralyze each victim for a feast. I didn't have to be an expert to put two and two together. No normal mosquito, or even 1,000 of them, could have done that. Something else was out here, something worse. I scanned the horizon and applied a little more pressure to the gas to pick up speed gradually. Instead of attracting whatever it was to my location with a roaring engine, 5 miles per hour, 10, 15. The monstrous images started to whiz on by at a sharp cruising pace. 20 miles per hour, 25. I turned my head to the left and saw a half-dead body flop up and down as a spear-sized stinger was inserted and removed from its abdomen. Then a cloud of mosquitoes burst out of the fog and descended on it, and my gaze drifted upwards, and I caught my breath. Of all of the things I'd seen that day, from the coated mummified corpses on the mountain, to the man laying face up in the river, to the crippled woman choking to death on mosquitoes near the bodies of her loved ones, nothing, and I do mean nothing, was as hideously grotesque as the car-sized, stinger-equipped mosquito hovering like an attack chopper over the wreckage of a minivan. I retched. I withheld a scream, and in panic, I released my foot from the brake and the SUV rolled forward again. I went along with it and decided a hasty retreat to the main road was the appropriate route. But the mosquito caught wind of our presence instantaneously and shot over in our direction. Oh, fuck. I slammed the gas for a second time, and the SUV fell into gear and rocketed off with a shudder while the mosquito was still closing the gap. Oh, move. But it was far too quick. and once it reached the SUV, it planted all 6 of its massive, hairy legs onto the rear of the vehicle and beat the air with its wings. I could feel the momentum of the car shift. The tires spun. My foot was on the gas, and the pedal was on the floor, but it was no use. The SUV started to roll backwards with an ear-splitting screech. Then at the worst possible moment, a fresh horde of mosquitoes swept in and out of the fog and consumed the front end of the car like a quilt. I threw the windshield wipers on a desperate countermeasure, but they wouldn't budge under the weight of the assault. Then more mosquitoes piled on to push the advance. Then more and more. Sunlight was thoroughly blotted out, and all I could hear was the deafening sound of 50,000 roaring wings. The glass began to bend, then it began to buckle, and then ever so slightly at first, but rapidly spreading, it started to crack. Michelle squeezed my hand with the last of her strength. I tried to squeeze back, but it hurt. The venom was taking its course on me too, and if Michelle's immobility and consciousness was any indication, I'd guess whatever paralytic agent, this was going to keep us both alive and aware while the mosquitoes had their way with us. I squeezed my eyes shut and thought of home, of being a kid, of falling in love. I whirled around just in time to see the trunk of the SUV get ripped clean off by the mosquitoes, which then shoved a wiry leg towards the front of the car. I swatted at it, but it was sharp and coarse, and hurt me more than it hurt it. As soon as I winced back in pain, the leg wrapped around my right wrist and yanked me out of the seat towards itself. Michelle watched and trembled, but could do nothing as I was dragged across the seatless rear area, kicking and screaming and wailing. I bumped into boxes and bags and smacked my head against the ceiling in the struggle, and when I was almost out, almost inside the damn thing's mouth, I felt my hand brush against the cold, chipped glass of something small. I looked down. The lamp. I grabbed it with my free hand and turned around. The mosquito's hideous, dangling sucker stinger was darting for my abdomen. I didn't hesitate. There was no time for panic. I swung the lamp up and forward, and I brought the wrath of God down upon its head. The glass, already chipped and worn out from the events of the last 24 hours, completely exploded. Shards flew in my face and near my eyes, but I could tell by the sudden release of pressure around my arm and waist, and from that bizarre shriek let out by the mosquito, that I'd caused far more damage than to myself. It dropped me, and I smacked the rib on the edge of the car as I fell and spilled out onto the dirt. Meanwhile, the mother writhed and beat the air frantically and furiously with her wings. Glass shards were lodged deep throughout her head, and her sucker hung by a thread of slime. She rolled around and clawed at her head with her arms, while I crawled back into the SUV and jumped into the driver's seat and threw it into gear. Come on, don't fail me now, baby. Come on, move. The SUV jumped and shuddered and shook, but it got rolling, and I wasted no time exploiting the chaos the mother's death had sown through the ranks of the mosquito's horde. 5 miles per hour. 10. 15. 20. 25. 30. The images of the chaos and the carnage flew past me. By now the mosquitoes had regained some of their composure and had given chase, but it was too late. The fog had begun to lift. I could see the main road now. 40 miles per hour. 50. 65. We were free. I looked at Michelle. She had a white-knuckled death grip on the edge of her seat and one hand planted firmly against the passenger window. White foam had started to pile up at the corners of her mouth, and her breaths were short and shallow, but her eyes were open wide and aware. She was still with me, for however long we had. We were pulled over by an officer for the state of the car. When he saw what happened, he escorted us to the emergency room. Michelle and I were treated with anti-venom with seconds to spare. In her case, and for a host of bruises, scrapes, cuts, and fractures. But we were alive. We made it through that nightmare in one piece, more or less. Over the course of the next few weeks, I heard stories of other survivors, battered and shaken, and with stories not too dissimilar from ours. Authorities investigated, and I'm not really sure what came of place after that, but I didn't care. I had Michelle. I had all 4 limbs, and not more than a handful of scars to show for the ordeal, and that was enough. I will say this though, I think I'm done hiking for a while. Maybe I'll pick up stamp collecting.
Welcome, Mortis Media listeners. Before I start this narration, I want to just say a special thank you to Mortis for sharing his platform to narrate this story for you. He's one of the select narrators out there that give channels like myself a chance to reach your lovely ears, and for that, I'm ever thankful. So cheers, Mortis, for being awesome, and thank you, listeners, for listening. My brother died when I was a child. He kept talking. I think people should know what he said. By the Emperor's Finest. We'd all known Dennis had less than a week, and we'd all braced ourselves for all the good that would do. This was going to tear us apart and leave a ragged gaping hole in all our lives. But that wouldn't be it. It would fit within our understanding of things, and we could all assume he went wherever we thought people go. That would have been so much easier, so much less troubling than what actually happened. Dennis had been diagnosed with cancer a couple of days after his 10th birthday, and it was all downhill from there. There was never an upswing, never an opportunity for surgery. All the scans showed the same thing, the oily black webs having grown larger and denser. The fact that we were twins, and had looked identical right up to when he started chemo, just made it worse. There I was right beside him, a perfect image of what he used to be, before his hair fell out, and his colour drained, and his cheeks sunk down into his skull. An emaciated ghost, constantly contrasted with what he should be. And then, finally, the doctor shut the case, snuffed out the last whispers of hope. Dennis will most likely last not more than 4 days, a week at most. So, we'd all set up camp in his musty room at the hospital. The walls were freckled and pea green. The only light slanted in between the shutters. Glaring bars stretching out across the floor, just short of Dennis's bed. The staff managed to bring in another, simpler bed for me, and my parents slept in old wicker chairs. Dennis looked really bad at this stage. You could as good as see his skull. We all wanted to talk to him, to make the most of whatever time was left. But he slept for most of the day, and when he woke up, there'd just be silence. Nobody knew what to say. There were no right words, and there was this underlying fear that the moment that anybody interacted with the situation, that it would somehow make it real, and it would hit everyone. The first sound would knock us all off the tightrope, and we'd fall into tears and chaos, and we wouldn't be able to pull ourselves back up. So, there was silence, my parents occasionally forcing smiles that never made it to their eyes. The third day was when it finally happened, when the steady beating of the heart monitor started to break down into frantic electronic wails, and Dennis began to shake feebly as the dry crackling sound rose up from his mouth. My parents exploded out of their chairs, my mother heading straight to Dennis, grabbing his shoulders and pleading at him to stop it and be alright. My father was at the room door, screaming down the hallway for help. The doctors and nurses at the hospital had changed lately. They started treating Dennis differently. Before, The resuscitations were always these frantic, desperate efforts, like 100-meter sprints. There was a desperate desire to succeed in every single moment. Now, it was different, more like a steady jog. These were people who were going through the motions, ticking off the things they were meant to try, from little checklists in their mind. I don't think it would have made a difference either way. The cancer had finally tipped over, and his system just couldn't shoulder it anymore. They called it and left, offering their condolences and saying they'd take away the body when we were ready. The door clicked shut behind us. Me, Mum, Dad, and Dennis's corpse. We all inched closer, up to the side of his bed, and just looked. My mother cracked, breaking into great howling tears. My father pulled her close, trying to keep it together but losing it in his own way. No sobs from him, just the occasional tear running down his face and sharp breaths bursting through his clenched teeth. I was just quietly staring at Dennis's face. We all stood there for a long time. I finally realized that this wasn't just one thing. This wasn't just a single event. For the first time, my mind started running away with itself and unfolding all the endless implications of this, every one of them causing my gut to sink. And for me to miss him so much, even though he'd just been here. I was never going to talk to him again. He was never going to laugh at me again. We were never eating dinner again. We were never going to school together again. We were never going to be in the same class in school again or talk during class at school again. It just kept going and going as I realized that this wasn't just one person I'd lost. I'd lost a million things. Something that was meant to be this constant presence was gone, and nothing would ever be as good as it should be again. Everything I was going to do would be soured by the certainty that I wouldn't be doing it with him, or that I wouldn't be able to tell him about it later. It had only ever been a childish assumption that any of that would happen. I was the first to see his lips quiver. Mum, Dad, his lips are moving. My parents froze, still clasped against each other. My mother curled over and supported my father. We looked down as his lips continued to quiver. My parents went quiet again. They must have been trying to hold back hope, assuming it was some kind of nervous tic. But it kept going. And finally, in a dusty, hoarse voice, so faint it was like you were hearing it on the wind, he said my name. Harry. My father sprinted across the room, yelling for the nurses to come back. My mother was clutching her mouth and stumbling back from the bed. The workers tumbled back in and went through the checklist and shocked him with the defibrillators a few times and reached their verdict. We're sorry, he's still dead. But I heard him talk, said my father in a small, pleading voice. Look, it could have been gas escaping. But, said my father before a tiny, scraping sound cut through the room. Everyone turning towards its source. It was coming from Dennis, halfway between a sigh and a croak. Harry, it's all so dark, so cold, so dark, and it's pulling me down, pulling at my insides and taking me down. A moment later, nurses started on their rounds again. But this wasn't some perfunctory run through the checklist. You could see it on their faces, in how hurried their movements were. They didn't know what was happening. They weren't even sure they were doing the right thing. They moved onto the defibrillator again, sending crashing waves of power down through Dennis's chest before listening with a stethoscope. Doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense, one was mumbling. After 10 minutes, they all stepped back. They'd run the checklist out. Nothing had happened. What's happening? My mother screamed. One of the men, a doctor I think, answered. Nothing is happening. We try and pump in oxygen and it does nothing. There's no pulse, and we can't induce one for more than a second or two. The body's temperature is down 3 degrees. He's deceased. But we heard him, I said. I know, but he's dead. The dry grating came again and everyone shut up. Please, Harry, where are you? I walked over to his side. I wasn't relieved he was talking, I was only afraid. This was wrong. I wanted to run. I wanted him to just be gone, so I could cry with my parents and be done with it. But I kept walking and put my hand on his bony, cold and clearly dead hand. I'm here, I said. I can see grey. A little bit of grey, but it's so far away. I don't just see it, I feel it. I feel it, and I never knew something could be so far away. I'm already so far down, but I need to get so much further to get to the grey. I didn't know how to respond, so I just stood there and listened to him talk about the darkness and the distant grey smudge. Sometimes he'd answer me, sometimes he wouldn't. And a lot of the stuff happened around me in the next few hours. Everyone who worked at the hospital must have been in and out. Even my parents started to leave sometimes, when they accepted I was the only one Dennis seemed to be aware of. Dennis was looked at by every type of doctor they had in there, and nobody understood. They started moving him around on a stretcher, taking him to the equipment they couldn't just bring to him. I had to come along. I was the only one who could keep him talking. It was a long time before anything was turned up. They'd gotten desperate and had put Dennis in a fMRI machine. They'd fully prepped a corpse and put it in a machine for the living. My entire family was in the room. A cold, confused fear had settled in my gut, making me feel a little bit like throwing up. I think we've got something, said the technician who was looking at the monitors. Please, just tell us what's happening. She had moved past terror and hope and was now above all else exhausted, her red face slack and empty. Look, this scan looks for where the blood is in the brain. Well, the thing is that none of the blood in the brain is moving. We know that from his pulse, but something is happening in there. Something the machine can only pick up a little, but there is some kind of activity. Now, I can't be sure, but I think the activity is clustered around some of the parts that control movement. Everything else is totally dead. He's obviously conscious. He's using complete sentences, but what? Said my father. But it's like whatever's doing the thinking is somewhere else, still interacting with the stuff that does the talking. That's exactly right, came a voice behind us. I looked over my shoulder and saw an old man in a grey business suit. He had a well-trimmed silver beard and was all around a strange contrast to the clumsy chaos that had engulfed the hospital. Who are you? Said the technician. I am Daniel Coens, he said, handing the technician a crisp business card. I'm with the Ophius Institute. We're a semi-private medical research body, and we've dealt with a few cases similar to this one. The hospital president has already agreed to let us look into this. Almost invisibly, a number of men had moved in behind Cohen and were now making their way over to the technician. These men will explain the confidentiality situation surrounding issues like this. We'll handle the boy from here. More men. These ones in pure white scrubs that had a strange logo on the left breast got Dennis back on the stretcher and led us all into the hallway. We followed wordlessly, never thinking to say anything because at least these new people represented new possibilities. A completely new road that might lead to an explanation. They rolled Dennis into an operating theatre and my mother gasped. Look, just what are you doing? Said my father in a husky voice that made it obvious he was still holding in tears. Coens, who had been striding ahead of the stretcher with a speed that belied his age, had stopped once we got to the theatre and was now taking deliberate care to look all three of us in the eyes. We were still in the hallway. The operating theatre door shut behind us. He answered in a low, comfortable tone.
We're not performing surgery. It's just the quietest part of the hospital. And there are no distractions in there. We want nothing more than to understand what has happened to your son. This sort of thing has happened before. Your son is conscious and, as we understand, he will only talk to his brother here. We want to use Harry to ask Dennis our questions. We believe this would work best if he and Harry were alone. We've got the theater wired so that we can hear the answers.
My parents didn't say anything for a while. My father broke the silence with weak, staggered words.
Do you think he might come back?
I know that even if he does, it won't be for long, but I'd really like him back. For however long. I didn't say enough. I wasn't big enough to say the things we had to say to each other.
If such a thing is possible, I swear we will do everything in our power to make it happen. We've prepared a private waiting room for you two.
Cohen's gestured down to the turn in the hallway. There were 2 people in the white scrubs standing there.
Pete and Shirley will lead you there, if you would please go with them.
My parents began to shuffle down the corridor, my mother still buried in my father's side. My father kept throwing looks back over his shoulder at me, like he was afraid I'd vanish. Soon, they were gone, and I felt Cohen's hand come down on my shoulder. I turned around to him and he knelt down, so we were closer to being level.
I know this is very hard on you. I know this must be the worst day of your life. But do you think you're up to a quick history lesson?
I couldn't bring myself to answer properly, but some curiosity managed to rise through the delirium and shock, and I nodded. Cohen's smiled.
One of the most significant moments of human history was the moon landing, and it's not even the fact itself that makes it so important. Do you think the moon landing would be what it was if we didn't have that kind of connection to our men as they strode the unsettling and inhospitable surface of a place we had never meant to have knowledge of? What if they just gone up and never come back? What if we knew for sure that they got there but had no signals from them?
I was still quite out of it, so I can't say I was properly digesting all of this. I slurred out, I don't know.
They didn't know if they could get the astronauts back. It was a very real possibility that they'd be left to die up there, stranded. Yet, they still did it. It didn't matter if the mission was a failure. It didn't matter if there was no triumphant return. Do you know what mattered? What mattered more than anything was speaking to them while they were up there, to have that connection with 3 brave men in the void, describing man's first steps into the unknown. If they'd never come back, it wouldn't have changed anything, as long as we down here managed to make that connection to the beyond. As long as we down here, for however long, had men up there, men to describe the soil, men to explain the feeling of being so light, men to tell us what the earth looked like, cut in half by the lunar horizon, men to teach us about a new world.
His hand tightened on my shoulder.
None of that would have been possible without the people in Houston, without the men who talked to the astronauts, kept them focused, made sure we got the information we needed. Harry, we believe Dennis is in a very strange place that humanity would do well to learn about. You are Houston, and your brother is an astronaut.
He pulled a laminated sheet out from under his lapel.
Here's a sheet with some topics you should focus on, and questions you should ask. This should help you get the most useful and needed information. But the most important thing is to keep him talking. Stop talking for 5 seconds and you could lose him.
I accepted the card, having given up on reaching a decent understanding of the situation. He ushered me into the operating theatre and shut the door behind me. I was alone. The only sound? An almost inaudible ringing that emanated from the massive stainless steel racks and implements and the cold, sturdy operating table Dennis was lying on. I approached the table and, in need of any sort of guidance, I looked at the laminated sheet. General principles. Try to keep your loved one, the subject, unaware of their deceased state. Past experiences suggest that the shock may cause disconnection. Maintain constant conversation, as this has been shown to help maintain the connection. Do not ask leading questions, such as whether your loved one, the subject, is having experiences in line with your own religious beliefs. First step. Ask your loved one, the subject, to describe their experiences and or surroundings. Encourage them to be as... A gasp pulled my attention away from the sheet.
Harry,
Dennis said. Yes, it's me, I answered, grabbing his hand. There was now no doubt that he really was dead. The hand was ice cold and the fingers had locked in place at odd angles with rigor mortis. His entire body had gone from the sickly white of the dying to the rain cloud shade of the dead.
I got to the grey, to the ground. Came down easy like a leaf. Cold. I'm standing there now.
Dennis, can you describe where you are?
It's still grey, but it's more real now. Solid. Grey sand underneath. Grey oceans behind me. Grey clouds above. Don't remember going through the clouds, but they're there now. The clouds, they're screaming.
An ocean? I said. Can you see anything in the ocean? Dennis took in a phlegmy, pointless breath.
Far away, the horizon, it gets dark. Dark, hungry lines where even clouds stop, where everything stops. Darkness is clawing, moving like it's alive. Miles and miles of angry, hungry dark. Can't go there. Can't go that way.
At this point, I lost the thread of the exchange as perspective suddenly hit. All the things I didn't understand and the fact that whatever Dennis was, he wasn't alive. I broke, crying and wailing and digging my face into his bare, emaciated ribs, cold like meat straight out of a fridge. I kept squeezing his hand harder and harder, pushing the stiff fingers closer together. Dennis, please come back, please. Wherever you are, just get back here.
Harry? Harry, are you crying? It's hard to tell. So much here sounds like crying.
His words struck me deep enough, making my sobs catch in my throat, and I just started looking at him again, settling back to my previous catatonic distance from what was happening. And I just started looking at him again.
I can't come back. No getting back. Like spilling something on the ground. No getting it all back inside and right again.
It took a few seconds to force myself to accept this, but I carried on, hoping that maybe I could steer him towards some sign that he was wrong. What's in the other direction, away from the ocean?
That's the way I have to go. If I try and swim, the darkness will tear me up, shred away everything until only my pain is left, and it'll toss that into the clouds and I'll scream.
Dennis, tell me what's in the other direction.
Just the sand, the grey sand, on and on. Not many bad things yet. Not many bad things to see yet. There'll be more when I get where I'm going. I'm going to start walking now, Harry.
Where are you meant to be going? I said. I started digging my nails anxiously into my forearms. There was something nauseatingly dreadfully true about everything he was saying. It was like the first time you learn the world is round, and it feels weird for a few seconds. But soon, you get used to the idea, and you see it's the truth. That's the big secret, and it doesn't matter how flat the ground feels. It doesn't matter how little sense it makes. It's true. And he just kept talking. I can see another person. Can you talk to them? I said, trying to keep my voice steady, feeling like I shouldn't be the one who couldn't keep it together. I suppose I could, but I can't. What do you mean? It's just not a talking kind of place. We were supposed to have done all our talking before we came here. Now we should just keep quiet. But you're talking to me, Dennis. But my voice isn't here. My voice is all the way up there, with you. Dennis, I said, now squeezing my eyes to force the tears back in. Dennis, please, tell me what's happening. I think I finally died. And what's happening now is what happens next. The thing that was always going to be happens next. It feels right, in a scary way. It's been expecting me for so long, since before I was even a fuzzy little thing that might happen. Since before our parents and their parents, and so far back, it's been expecting me. Please, stop talking like that. You don't talk like that, you never have. Sorry, you just sort of see things different here. Some things you know without even being told. Some things you forget. I couldn't think of anything to say and started to worry, remembering that if I left the pauses too long, he could stop answering. Hey, said Dennis, and the edges of his mouth strained out, awkwardly imitating a smile. I see a few more, and they're all naked, but really naked. Their clothes are off and they're all grey and wrinkly, but that's not it. You can kind of see inside them, like all the walls have fallen down, and you can see who they are, all their thoughts and feelings, just kind of hanging around them like ghosts. It's like someone's pulled the clothes off their whole past. They're so naked, Harry. He made a light coughing sound that was meant to be a laugh. That's really scary. Oh, I thought you might have thought it was funny. I don't think we're going to laugh at the same stuff anymore. I think you're different now. I guess that makes sense. So, what are all the people doing? Most of them are moving, same direction as me, towards the center. The center of what? It's just called the center. Maybe the center of everything. But what? I said, starting to lose control. Why do you have to go? I don't have to. Nobody has to, just like you don't have to shake someone's hand when they put it out, or answer them when they talk to you. But it would feel wrong not to. It's what you're meant to do, and there's not any other good options. You don't want to stand still. What happens when you stand still? Depends. A few days ago I passed this woman. A few days? I said, gripping the cold steel of the operating table as I was filled with an eerie sense of vertigo. You haven't been dead for even a day. I passed her a few days ago, he said, carrying on like he hadn't heard me. She didn't reach the center. She just sat down, started going her own way. She pulled one side of her ribcage out and it all stretched, spreading up to her left so high, stretching out the arm, grabbing its corner. Most of her skin started to get hard and flaky, like old wood or crumbling stone. I can see her, self, musician, liked music, kind of thought of her life like a song. Sometimes it repeated itself, some bad notes here and there, but it was pulling itself together. She was reaching the chorus and it ended. It was over so fast, and she can't accept it. She picked this sharp rock off the ground, and she's scraping it past her ribs like a huge harp, or something angry. Trying to make music, keeping the song going, but it's an awful sound. Soaring bone, and it's never going to replace what should have come next. She's already grown into the ground. She's going to be here forever, trying to make the music she missed out on. There was nothing to say to that, so I just went quiet for a while, assuming he'd keep talking. He didn't. Dennis. Dennis! No answer. A terrified jolt ran through me, and I started slamming my fist onto his chest. Dennis! Come back, Dennis! A growl tore out of his mouth, and his frame thrashed upward, causing me to jump back and tumble down onto the floor, smashed into the surgeon's shelves, and causing gleaming surgical instruments to rain down around me. I didn't have time to think before I'd forced myself up again and bent over the operating table to stare desperately into my brother's eyes. I took his hand again, squeezing it as hard as I could. "Harry," he said, and relief flooded through me. "It's been so long. So long, it's been years." "What?" "I've been walking for years. Years and years. It keeps getting worse." "It hasn't been a day." "It's been so many years and everything keeps getting worse." "What? What's worse?" "It gets worse closer to the center. There's so many people now, thousands, tens of thousands, and they're all walking to the center." "But what's so terrible?" "There's more. So many more, like the girl with the harp I told you about. Stuck in place, trying to fix what happened, angry about what happened, rooted to the ground, moaning, calling out names of the people they think did this to them. Sometimes a few join up, and when they get all hard and crackly like old statues, they start to grow together, start to feel each other's pain. Sometimes there's mountains of them, entire landscapes of people crying about how unfair it all is. I'm still walking." "But where are you going?" "I told you, the center. I'm getting close now. All the clouds with their screaming faces and curving, all curving and being pulled in the same direction, twisting their way into the center. Please, just stop walking and come back." "Can't. No coming back. Besides, I have to keep moving like everyone else, doing something weird. It's the quickest way for the walkers to notice you." "Oh God, what are the walkers?" "Started seeing them more as I got towards the center. They're all over the place now. They're these things, walk around on 3 legs like stilts, covered in sharp, black shells like thorns. Remember the aquarium? They're kinda like those urchins we saw at the aquarium. But the top part, the main part, is more exact, kinda arty, like a sculpture designed the shape. Reminds me of some kind of chess piece. When they notice you, they come over you, toppling towards you but never falling over on those legs. Spindly. Yeah, that's what you'd say. They're spindly legs, and they stop right over you. You're just between their legs, and you see the holes under their main bit, and the tendrils come out. Red, windy tendrils with these itchy hairs come down, and they start curling and swinging all around you. You almost don't mind at first because they're red. You've been seeing nothing but grey and black for years, and the tendrils are red, and it's beautiful. But then, they touch you. They touch you, and it's awful. Every bad thing you've ever felt, every bad thing that ever happened to you, starts bubbling up to the surface, drowning you. All the pain that ever went into you rises up and out. The walkers feed on it. They lick it with their tendrils. They love the taste of all the things that shouldn't have happened. They love to taste the misery. Eventually they get full and move on, and you get up and keep walking. Jesus, Dennis. Jesus. It's fine. They're bad. But you get a sense of perspective here. Sure, they're scary for you, but they're nothing next to the center. They're bottom feeders, moss that grew on the outskirts. If they're really like sea urchins, then the center must be like a shark, or a whale, or some huge thing right at the bottom of the sea that's too big to come up near the surface. You've never said things like this before. I don't know how to describe it. When you're here, stuff just breaks down.
a little, and you don't always need to have learned a word to know it. This place is less obsessed with causes and 2 + 2 equaling 4. Its job isn't to make sense.
But what is its job?
I don't know. Maybe I'll find out at the center.
He went quiet again, and this time I wasn't sure I wanted to stop him drifting off. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear any more of this, but regardless of what I wanted, another groan soon creeped out of his mouth and he was back.
Shit, I see it now. I see the center.
His hand began to close, slowly but inevitably around mine, overcoming the rigor mortis to press in on my fingers like an iron vice. I kept trying to get out, almost yanking off the table, but I couldn't even budge inside this agonizing grip.
It's inside. Inside this huge thing, like a beehive, floating above the ground. It's grey too, grey, and covered with streaks and ridges, like it was used to be liquid and hardened ore. It's like it's made of web or something. So big, Harry. I've never seen anything like it. All the clouds are swirling down into the hole at the top of it, still screaming. Hundreds of holes, messy, ragged holes, pitch black on the inside. It's bigger than cities, Harry, and everyone's heading towards it. Thousands and thousands swarming under it, pushing against each other to climb the bridges. Messy bridges from the ground right up to the holes, right into the pitch black. The center's in there, Harry. I'm here.
Please, I said, whispering with the pain in my hand. You can't go in. There's nothing good in that place. I knew this as a fact, not just because of the description, but as a gut feeling. I knew that what he was talking about was real and fundamental, as important and part of our existence as the sun and the moon and birth, but bad somehow, dripping with wrongness to its core.
Where else is there to go? I'm at one of the bridges.
Please, you can come back.
No, that'd be like going back into the womb. Can't be done. This is what's next. Oh.
What? Why?
Oh God, I'm starting to feel something. I think the center's doing it. I'm getting bitter. Every mean, spiteful, everything angry in me, it's swelling, spreading out and smothering the rest of me. I'm so mad, Harry. I'm getting so much smaller, and my hate is getting so much bigger.
His hand tightened, and I screamed.
Why was it me? Why was it me and not you? What did you do that I didn't? What did I do that you didn't?
I'm sorry, I said, fully in tears. His voice had changed. It was still quiet, but it was rapid. Each word growled and soaked with vitriol.
I hate you. Do you know that? Still able to stand. Still able to run. Still able to breathe. I fucking hate you. I was hurting all the time. And you just stood there feeling sorry for me. You couldn't feel any of it. Just waiting to see me die so you could fuck off and do everything I never would.
I was yelling and screaming for someone to come in and help. I'd almost pulled Dennis off the table, his torso hanging over the side, held straight by whatever force was allowing him to squeeze my hand. In all this, his eyes were still as dead as they'd always been. And then we went limp. His hand let go. His back sagged and he crashed to the floor. He'd broken 3 of my fingers, but shock was keeping it distant. I threw myself down onto my knees to see his face, slapping it, and looking for any sign he was still there. He gasped again, fainter than ever now.
Oh no! Oh Jesus! I'm inside, and it's so much worse than I thought. It's beyond worse. It's so far past the worst I thought something could be.
Please, Dennis, please, tell me what's happening.
It's the center. It's so big and floating above me. It's so much bigger than the hive, so much bigger than what's inside. The whole inside is so much bigger, it's so big. It's grey too, always grey, grey and cracked like stone all over, endless miles of it.
His voice had changed. It was whiny and small and afraid.
It's hurting me, Harry. It's hurting me more than I ever been hurt. And it hasn't even noticed me.
Please, the man told me you need to describe it. He said if you kept talking, you might stay.
So big,
He said, his voice wobbling and breaking like he was crying.
Its fingers are bigger than skyscrapers, and it has so many fingers, millions, and ribs. The body is all ribs. Or are they just fingers all folded up? I don't know, but there are so many and so big, Harry. And the masks, Jesus.
What masks?
The masks, it faces bigger than countries, all different. Some of the eyes are perfect circles. Others have huge pointy holes where the mouths should be. Some are blank and some have 8 eye holes, and some look like human faces. Like perfect human faces with deep, dark, hollow eyes, all of them. The inside of all of them is so dark, a living dark, a pulsing dark, pulsing all together, and it's so huge, and you can feel it pressing it on you, filling the air with badness and crushing down on you, and from inside you can feel the bad in you reaching out to it like a baby reaching out for its mum. And Jesus Christ, Harry.
He was breathing in and out faster and faster, shallow sacred breaths, instincts overcoming the fact that he didn't need air. Dennis, talk to me. What is it? What is it?
It's not the devil. No, that's what I thought at first, but it's not. It's more like God. It's like if God hated everything.
His breath hiked up again.
Oh, Jesus, it sees me. Please, please promise me one thing. Just one thing.
What? What is it?
Please don't ever die.
One last breath rolled out of his mouth. I tried everything to get him back. Everything I could think of in an animalistic burst of desperate energy. I hit him, shook him, pleaded, but he was really gone this time. I knelt there in the room for a while. His last words carving into a deep part of my mind I knew I could never dig them out of. The next few hours, in fact, the next few days were kind of a blur. I remember men in the Institute's white scrubs coming in and dragging me away from the body. I remember my hands getting seen to and put in a cast and sling. I remember Daniel Cohen sitting me down in a bright white room and interrogating me. He called it a conversation, but it was an interrogation. A warm interrogation, but a man who could be kind if it meant getting what he wanted. He asked me if I had any visions or any strong sensations, if I thought Dennis was telling the truth, and if I could explain the ways in which Dennis was acting differently than he already was. I was detached and drowsy from exhaustion and trauma and pain from my hand, and just answered honestly. At the end, Cohen's made me memorize a phone number and sign a load of confidentiality forms, making it very clear that not a word of this could leave the hospital. I was to call if I started experiencing any phenomena I thought were related to my Dennis, and finally, they left. My parents and I took a taxi home. We didn't talk about what had happened after Dennis died, and I suppose that even that was this secondary add-on to the simple fact that Dennis was now properly dead, and not coming back. We went home, got to bed, and the next morning we had a wordless breakfast with an extra chair pulled out. The years flew by and the whole experience became something I just had to live with, some dreaded thing my thoughts would sometimes steer me back to, but mostly I managed to keep living, to accept it all as something I couldn't understand. The fact that Dennis was gone was always worse than the way he went, however terrifying and unnatural it was. But lately, I've been having a dream. It started off vague and incomplete, but every few nights it repeated, getting longer and more vivid. It always starts the same, with me and Dennis, both of us kids again, on a green hill on a bright clear day, crisp air sighing past us. I can't remember most of the words, but the gist is that he's bragging, showing off, saying that Dad loves him more, that he's better than me, that he's going to keep being better for as long as he's alive. He's going to keep making Dad love him more for as long as he's able. And I'd gotten so mad. Way madder than I'd ever gotten if he'd said those things in real life. I see a rock and without thinking, I pick it up and attack him with it, knocking him over and beating him again and again until his skin was swollen and torn and you would see parts of his skull underneath. He managed to push me off and run, and I followed, never thinking twice about it. I chased him so far until finally he runs into a pass between two mountains in a long, dark range that I somehow never see until that point. The range extends to either side, seemingly forever, and the sky above it is saturated with heavy dark clouds. It's like Mordor or something. I always stop running at this point, knowing that I've chased him far enough. The job is done. I start to leave my body, surging forward down the pass, no longer myself. Just a nameless, thoughtless observer, gliding like a ghost for a lack of legs. He runs down the dark pass, on and into a sunless, barren country on the other side, a place where the soil is grey and dry. He runs for ages, but soon he stops and falls and curses me, screams about how much he hates me and how much I cost him by driving him into this place. He rages for a long time. Then a second person comes, sometimes a man, sometimes a woman, sometimes old and sometimes young. They say they too were driven past the mountains, or that they wandered past them by mistake and can't get back over. Dennis always says the same thing. Then let's suffer together, let's hurt together. And this person always latched on to Dennis, and Dennis latched back, and they scream or cry and say they want to see people who wronged them skinned alive. And more always come, a trickle first, then a flood, latching onto Dennis and the first person, all of them clasping together and piling up into a giant, deafening mass of squirming bodies, and eventually it's huge, almost up to the clouds. And then there's a rumbling, a massive shifting sound. The countless bodies start to rearrange, forming deep canyons of flesh that make up a horrendous, rage-filled outline of a face. There's a shift greater than any earthquake. The pile moves, rolling forward, pulling itself with enormous appendages made of the miserable, the bitter, and the despairing. It inches and tumbles on, crashing down and dragging itself onwards with overwhelming apocalyptic sounds, and then I see that it's heading for the mountain range. It's heading back to the bright place with all its anger and hate and vengeances. And as much as it's made of millions and millions of people, I always know it's still one thing with one will, but all the hatreds of everyone buried in it. And all the way back to the first one to curse, his rage still in there, rage directed at the first one, to sin. It gets right up to the mountains. Then, I wake up. I think something's coming. Something that's got started a long time ago. Something that strips away good and builds itself on the bad. And I think it's almost strong enough to set out, to start moving. And I think when it gets here, the living will be no better off than the dead.
Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Stories, Fables, and Ghostly Tales. I really have to hand it to him. His narration was outstanding, and the use of music throughout was superb. So thank you for helping me bring this incredible story to life. Please go check out and support this incredible creator. You can find a link to his latest work on screen now. Or show him some love by clicking the button on the right hand side. stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.